Hey everybody, welcome to chunk number 3, for lack of a better term, of this week's lecture. In this little chunk, we're going to talk about form criticism. I remind you that I changed the order of the criticisms from your textbook. The author of your textbook goes source, form, redaction, and I want to go source, redaction, form. Because I think once you understand redaction criticism a little better, form criticism makes more sense. So, to remind you, redaction criticism looks for those methods or intentions behind the arrangement of the material in the Gospels. One example we used was between Mark and Matthew in how the same story was told. In Mark, much more thoroughly. In Matthew, it's just 2 verses where Jesus has a catch-all of healings while he sits down on the mountainside. And an interpretation of that difference is that Matthew didn't want the readers thinking that Jesus was some sort of magician, so he edited that content to make it more powerful in the name of the God of Israel rather than in the name of Jesus of Nazareth. So that leads us to form criticism. Now, form criticism depends heavily on redaction criticism and vice versa, so we could have taken them in any order. I just think it's neater to take it this way. Take that for what it's worth. So, form criticism depends entirely on the findings of redaction criticism. So I think you have to do redaction first and then apply the forms. If the gospel authors edited source material to create their particular texts, then what did that source material look like? Further, if we can cut away the layers of additions to the words of Jesus that were put there by the early church or the gospel writers themselves, then can we get all the way back to Jesus? And again, this is the most important work we could possibly do if we believe that Jesus is the Son of God, if he really is the Messiah, the second person of the Godhead. If we really do believe that about him, then digging our way back to his authentic words is very much a worthwhile task. We're not just out here wasting our time. So, form criticism helps us cut away the layers that have built up around the sayings of Jesus as the Gospels have passed through thousands, millions, billions of hands over the history of the church. So what's the goal of form criticism? Well, as we mentioned just a moment ago, it's to get back to as much of an authentic set of the words of Jesus as possible. Now to do that, we have to get through all the different versions of the Gospels that we can find, try to analyze where the different units that were redacted and arranged are, and then try to cut away what may have been added as interpretations by the early church, and work our way back through that tunnel layer to the actual words of Jesus. If we could get to the tunnel layer, oh man, that's close. That's within 30 years of the actual words of Jesus. Man, that'd be some powerful stuff, wouldn't it? To actually be able to have 100% confidence that Jesus of Nazareth actually said this little paragraph right here. And boy, that'd just be powerful, I think, in preaching in the church. So what's the goal? Well, our goal is to work our way all the way back through to the actual words of Jesus. So how does the form critical method process work? First, we have to find the seams of the text. Where do the paragraph marks belong? Where is there a switch in the narrative? There are things that people have been identifying in the New Testament for thousands of years where the narrative changes or where there seems to be a break in the story, where the editor or author of the gospel adds in a little narrative flair, talks about Jesus leaving one place and going to another place and sitting down and starting a new conversation, like in Matthew, where Jesus has a series of dialogues in seemingly random places. Those are the seams of the text where we can almost see the edges of where Matthew or Mark or Luke arranged different sources to communicate what they wanted to communicate. So secondly, we have to analyze the literary framework of the document. Uh, this is sort of like the goal of redaction criticism, where we're trying to figure out the theological intentions behind the editing of the New Testament. This requires just a ton of knowledge about the ancient world, because the ancients read differently than we did. Well, that's an exaggeration. Very, 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 very few people in the ancient world could read and write. So when we say they read differently than we did, they didn't have a lot of Twitter back then, is what I'm trying to say. So what we have to do is have a pre-existing set of knowledge about how they interpreted metaphor and how they understood symbolism and how they interpreted word choice. Whereas in our world, if you don't like a word, you find a synonym and plug it in there, or you explain yourself in another 75 words or so. In the ancient world, you couldn't do that. You couldn't retweet something and edit it. You couldn't go back and change your Insta post, because once you wrote it down, it was permanent, and you wanted it to be permanent, because you probably made your living from writing little words on animal skins. So this again requires just an insane amount of background knowledge about the ancient Near East and how they perceived literature. Finally, the goal is to identify the function of the pieces that we found. Okay, so we've identified the seams of the different little paragraphs or different little sayings found in the gospel document. So then we start to ask, okay, now that we've identified that this is a standalone unit or pericope of the New Testament, what's the impact that this little paragraph or this story or this saying has on the chapter or on the section of the gospel or on the gospel as a whole? What would have been the impact of this on how Matthew or Mark or Luke or even John are presenting the story of Jesus? So one of the questions we can ask is this a miracle story because the narrative needed a miracle story right here? Or would a miracle story have had more impact than another type of story, say an apothegm or a parable, for a specific community?